Hey, it's Dr. Crone again with the second of our two online lectures in the Parties and Interest Groups unit. This lecture we're going to focus on interests in society, such as business, laborers, farmers, scientists, religious organizations, things like that, and how their interests get represented in the political world. We'll focus on two patterns of organizing political and social interests: pluralism and corporatism. To start with, let's be sure we understand what interest groups are. They're organizations that represent a particular social interest to and within the political world. For example, soybean farmers. This is my favorite Ohio relevant example. So soybean farmers make their living based on the market for their beans and the conditions for growing those beans, and they want to make the best living that they can. So there's an interest group, the American Soybean Association, that represents those interests in the US political sphere. So that group is advocating for public policy decisions that help soybean farmers make a better living. They don't represent any other ideas, any other ideologies or points of view or anything like that. They focus solely on the interests of their members. So in our last video, we focused on political parties. And parties and interest groups have a lot in common. They both represent and advocate for citizens. Some of their similarities are that they act as linkage organizations, so they link citizens with government. They give citizens an opportunity for collective action, meaning that they can act together with others who have like interests in order to achieve a political goal. They're much more likely, the theory of collective action says we're much more likely to make progress on our goals if we are able to do that in a collective. They mobilize citizens, so meaning they get citizens involved and engaged in politics, and they both act to represent policy positions of citizens. But there are important differences. So the goal of a political party is to win elections and control government. And so therefore, parties in modern democracies, catch-all parties, like we talked about in the last lecture, they have a very broad appeal. So parties are likely to appeal to lots of different interests in society. For example, the Democratic Party in the United States appeals to those who are pro-life. That's one interest. But they also appeal to laborers and labor unions. That's another interest. They don't necessarily share the same policy views, but the party represents both of them. Interest groups are different in their goals and their appeal. So interest groups' goal is not to win elections, but to change public policy or to preserve existing public policy in a way that would represent the goals of the citizens they represent. And so they may try to influence elections to that they think, if they want change in public policy, they're going to try to influence elections to maybe get new people elected, that kind of thing. But their goal is not to win an election and control the government, but rather it is just to affect the government. And they tend to have a much narrower appeal. We talked about that with the soybeans. Pluralism and corporatism are broad terms that represent two different patterns of the ways that interest groups can have influence in a political system. So pluralism is the pattern that is found in the US, and so Americans tend to understand it best, and oftentimes we assume that other countries have that same pattern. The foundational idea of pluralism is competition among interest groups. So in pluralism, a system like that, there are an unlimited number of interest groups that are involved in the political sphere, and they compete with each other to try to influence public policy. And what they're doing is they don't belong to the government, rather they work outside of government. They are outside of government, and their job is to try to influence lawmakers and bureaucrats who are within the government. So there's an emphasis in pluralism on the competition between the groups, and in majority rule decision making. So let's say that there is that a country like Britain, which also has pluralism, is deciding on new labor policy, like people in labor unions wanting better better wages or working conditions. So that will be seen in a country with pluralism as sort of a zero-sum game where either the unions or the businesses are going to win, and the lawmakers will listen to both sides and make a decision on which side they support. Pluralism is because the competition really goes along with a free market economic system, a strong free market system with very few government rules, kind of like in the United States and to a certain extent in Britain as well. So that's what pluralism is, and it's the system that, like I said, American students tend to be most familiar with. But corporatism is not a competing, but it's another pattern, and it exists all over the world. It's a totally different way of thinking about how interests get represented. And please note that this exists both in democracies and in authoritarian systems. It may sound to you at first like it's more of an authoritarian idea, but it can exist in democracies as well. So the fundamental idea, the foundational idea of corporatism is the incorporation of social interests into political decision making. So for corporatism, there are not unlimited interest groups. Rather, there are officially recognized groups to represent each interest in society, and usually these are fairly broad kinds of things. So you're going to have like a catch-all labor union that represents all workers in a society, or all factory laborers in a society, or something like that. And the groups are not outside of government as much as they are actually integrated into government as official representatives within the policy-making process. So for example, in a country that has corporatism, when wages and working conditions are being set, the government, and particularly the bureaucracy, there will be official representatives of officially recognized interest groups who are part of the bargaining process within that bureaucracy to set those working conditions for a certain period of time. And they will be both labor and business will be sort of all incorporated into that process. So this is a system that, rather than emphasizing competition and sort of majority rulemaking, is going to emphasize cooperation and consensus among all of the interested parties. This can be associated with more authoritarian governments, socialism, communism, or fascism, but it's also possible that it can be democratic. Many examples of countries that either have in the past or today practice corporatism, including Germany, Mexico, and Japan. We'll go into some of those in more detail in a minute. So let's look at some of these examples of different kinds of systems. So we'll take the US as the kind of the classic example of the pluralist model. So in the United States, interest groups are freely competing for influence. And the theory behind pluralism, or why it's considered a positive thing, is that basically what it is the world of interest groups is completely free and open, and lawmakers are listening to these interest groups to try to discern what is best for the public by saying, well, this one group wants this thing, but this other group wants this thing, and so they can get a sense for the sides of an argument, and then they make their decision that way. In practice, in a pluralist system, the influence of interest groups is found both kind of within government and without, but not as an accepted part of government. Not like in pluralism, but rather you have lobbyists who are during the editing portion of bills, they will lobby members of the congressional committees who are making those decisions and say, look, our group would really like you to take out this part of the bill or put in something else. So they do that. That's called inside lobbying. There's also outside lobbying, where groups are ask their members, hey, your members are going to be voting, your representatives are going to be voting on a bill, and we don't want it to pass. Call your representative quickly and tell them not to vote, to vote our way, not to vote for this bill. They'll also participate in advertising to kind of whip up public support or antagonism for a bill that's being considered. And they also have influence in by trying to get bureaucrats to make regulatory decisions that favor their group, or to try to get judges, especially elected judges who, at the state levels, get judges nominated and elected who support their perspective. And usually these are often business influences. So there's a lot of pros and cons to this model and the other model. The pro for pluralism really is a liberty argument. Like, everybody in the country has the freedom to organize a group. There can be different groups that represent a similar interest. And so if we look at the environmental interest groups in the United States, there are many different ones. So if you belong to the Sierra Club, or you're a leader in the Sierra Club, and you think, well, I don't like the Sierra Club's way of representing the environmental movement, you can create your own interest group. You can break off and create a rival group that represents the environmental movement differently, or has a different philosophy, or maybe even a different business model for raising money or things like that. So groups can, the free association of groups for a pluralist and people who really like this system say, this is how Americans get represented in their government, is this freedom that we all have to belong to a group, to start a new group, and we're not limited in any way by that. And every group, at least theoretically, can be heard equally. So a downside of pluralism is that in practice, it turns out that the wealthy business interests are much more influential than sort of public interest groups, or groups that try to advocate for either nonprofit type of ideas, or advocating for labor, for example, or consumers. Those groups don't have as much influence as businesses and banks and financial institutions and things like that. And there are no regulations on that. And then another con of this system is that oftentimes there are groups of people who have, their political problem is they don't have the resources to even create a group. So if we think of people in poverty, they don't have the resources to put into what it would take to start their own group. So theoretically, they could start a group to advocate for people living in poverty, or people living on minimum wage, or something like that. But it takes resources to do that. The government doesn't just do that for you. And the fact that they don't have resources is both their political problem and a block to their participation in the pluralism system. So some people really don't, sort of say pluralism isn't the best system for representing people in the United States, or another country that practices pluralism. Many countries practice pluralism. France, Britain, numerous countries do that. So we'll look at Mexico, because it's kind of an interesting example of a country that has transitioned from a strong corporatist model to a pluralism system. So Mexico was originally a corporatist democracy from the time that it really took off as a democracy in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And part of the reason for that was it's tied into political parties, because it had this big catch-all party that was the only thing going in the Mexican political system, the PRI. And there was very little distinction between the party and the government. And for the party to stay in power, it actually incorporated these interests in society. It incorporated both business, labor, and peasants into a giant whole. And it wasn't just the party that had that to contribute to its electoral self. The party shaped the government, and so the government also sort of incorporated these interests. And rather than having them compete against each other, rather than having labor get fragmented down into steel workers versus plumbers versus electricians, where they were all competing to try to be heard and get something for themselves, there's one big giant labor wing of the party. There's one big giant business wing. There's one big giant sort of farmer, agricultural, peasant wing of the party. And each of those big sectors are involved in government decision making. So they, in a corporatist system, like I said, labor has a strong contribution to cooperating with business, and business has to cooperate with them too in order to, create a consensus rules about wages and things like that. So corporatism really helped the PRI and this coalition of peasants, labor, and business that all are represented, within government without, and all of the any kind of conflict between them is all mitigated by this sort of overall paternalistic party. That lasted for a really long time until sort of the late 1990s, as Mexico's economic development is going on. They're really starting to develop a strong middle class and a much stronger tertiary economy. So this is economic development that we talked about way back in January or February. And what the development of the tertiary service economy really starts to crack the cozy relationships that have been happening between business and labor, because now there's this new interest in society that isn't really represented, and plus there are more educated people with more money to spend who are starting to question whether the PRI really represents them at all. And the growth of that leads to the development of the PAN party, which was the original rival to the PRI. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, Mexico becomes a competitive multi-party, two-party system, really. And today, from the early 2000s till now, Mexico has become rather rapidly a competitive multi-party system. So corporatism kind of died off as new interests sprang up in the society that weren't part of the old system. And that's actually one of the biggest sort of downsides or cons of corporatism, is that because there really isn't much room to represent social changes, things like urbanization, things like economic development, because there's much more pressure for things to stay the old way, to stay stuck, because you have these kind of entrenched interests that just keep saying, we need, labor and business, and are more important, and they're of course more about the secondary economy. The other downside of this is it is associated with authoritarian governments, especially fascism. Fascism is really one of the points of fascism, is to have a corporatist economy where all of the interests in society are working together, quote, for the good of the state. And we know how that worked out. So it kind of gets a bad rap, and it certainly is open to manipulation by dictators and people like that. By the way, Latin America is probably the place where there has been the strongest tradition of corporatism. And if you want to know more about corporatism, classes, if you go on to study at a four-year school, if you take a class in Latin American politics, you'll learn lots and lots more about corporatism and how it has affected political development in Latin America. So it's common for many people to sort of dismiss corporatism and say, oh, well, it's a Nazi idea, it's a bad idea. But what I want to point out is that there are lots of democracies, particularly in Northern Europe, where corporatism is an important part of their economy, and these are robust democracies. So they're robust democracies and robust economies. And Germany is one of the best examples of that. You can read more about that in the case studies in your book if you would like to. But in Germany, despite the fact that they do have a free market and a very competitive, economic system, the German system of government does appoint broad labor unions and broad business organizations and broad financial organizations to be part of decision making of the government. So the bureaucracy invites these groups in, makes them official participants in the process of bargaining, with the government kind of almost acting like a mediator. So regulations about labor conditions, regulations about production goals and things like that are set in Germany, not in an authoritarian way, but in a way that says, look, we want all of these voices to have a seat at the bargaining table, rather than just be shouting at the legislature from outside and trying to be heard. They're actually part of the process of legislating and regulating. And what corporatism has really done for Germany and other countries like that is having these groups that are official representatives of these interests in society helps to keep the economy stable, even when leadership changes. So when one party takes over after another party, there isn't this wild swing like we sometimes see in the United States from, sort of more liberal policies to more conservative policies. All of these policies are more likely to stay middle of the road and consistent because they've been worked on not just by legislators or party members, but by all of these interests in society. And your textbook really says that part of Germany's success and stability has been that they are a consensus-based country. That they have coalition governments. They have these grand coalitions between the two big parties, where the liberals and conservatives are really governing together. And then that goes along with the system of corporatism, in that Germany has become good at soothing over and smoothing over social divisions. Now, of course, there's more to Germany than just consensus, and certainly Germany is experiencing right now challenges to that consensus, especially from the right wing, and from neo-fascists and right-wing nationalists. But in the past, at least, we'll see what happens in the future for Germany, but in the past, at least, this corporatist system has contributed a lot to their stability and economic growth. All right, so that's the end of our lecture on pluralism and corporatism. And remember, this is the second video in our unit. So once you've watched both of them, you're ready to post on the discussion board. And I'm going to give you the challenge this week to tie our discussion to the country you're studying. And I'm going to give you the additional direction that I will give 5 extra credit points to anybody who adds 3 takeaways about your country's political parties to your original 6 takeaways. So for extra credit, 9 takeaways, and 3 of them have to be about your own country's political parties, the country you're studying, and maybe a little bit about how what you've learned here or in previous lectures applies to that. So good luck with that. I'll look forward to reading those, and talk to you later.